Hey everyone, Rob Bertholf here, and just continuing along in the theological track in the course on theism. And in this module, we're going to be discussing ultimately religion as a science. And for me, the only way I've found to truly understand and defend what I believe on and is by treating it as an art form, not as an art form, but as a science, right? So for me, that's a matter of thinking about how do I treat religion as a science, and it's by really understanding world history, factoring in mathematics and physical science and biology and any sort of demonstrable physics, as well as just common sense and basic logic to figure out, what is real, what is logical, and what ultimately is fables and is not backed by anything real. And so for me, when I'm thinking about the commonality and differences, right, when I took my journey to seek out what I would identify as objective truth, I started to research and analyze what is out there. And so I started by really looking at all the different religions that we have in the world today. What were their figures, who were their founders, what artifacts, what festivals are associated with each religion, and how do they compare and contrast with maybe previous religions. I found that the need to understand the history, or more importantly, understanding how a religion was formed, brings a lot of clarity and a lot of context about that religion. What I mean by that is, if a religion pops up out of nowhere, and I believe that there is a God that's existed through all time, I have to question, well, why is it only showing itself now? Versus maybe a religion that came out from another religion that was a progressive understanding or a new revelations, to me has more of a a believable approach. And so when I tackle some of these religions, what I started to do was just kind of create a spreadsheet, right? Like, what are all the different religions, and getting a sense on what are their commonalities, what are their differences. An example of this would be using diagrams, right? So I wanted to really get a sense on mapping different religions and similarities, differences. Here we see how Chinese folk religions, there seems to have, really every variation except monotheism, right? With Confucianism, there is no God. With which is somewhat shared with Buddhism, but in that God is in us, or that our gods are able to transcend, the concept of God. The overlap with Taoism is that God is in everything. So this was my approach, really, and there's a lot more of this, but just to kind of share it as in a simple form, I use the skills really that I teach for marketing and for programming and for product ideation and product architecture. And so I really recommend, if you're interested in my course on core skills, this is my mentorship series, where I really talk about pattern matching and taxonomy and how to look at things in visual ways. I think the more visually we start to, really get clarity around, make concrete the abstract, I think allows us to start processing it better. And so again, one of those skills is taxonomy. And I think, breaking religions up, really down, breaking them up into parts and classifying them and seeing them as ways that becomes easier to understand. For me, looking at religions and then different branches of religions or denominations in those branches or sects in those denominations, ultimately different churches, gives me a clearer sense of how it all fits together, differences, commonalities, etc. I really like this statement that there is a science of Christianity to be mastered, a science as much deeper, broader, higher than any human science, as the heavens and are higher than the earth. The mind is to be disciplined, educated, and trained. I really believe that this for me encompasses what I'm trying to do with generally world religions. And if you haven't watched the previous video on this in Module 1, I really spoke about the idea that when I wrote my book, Theological, when I wrote that book, I wrote it in a state of agnosticism, in a state of not understanding, even potentially atheism. I wrote it in a way where I was actually exploring things with fresh eyes and wanting to understand what was real. What we're going to find in this is that there's now a bias that has been formed from me, and so we'll see Christianity in a lot of different senses, as well as different specific religions that I'll be analyzing based on really the lens that I have formed through my research of about 5 years of studying world religions and history, etc. So if you want the agnostic version, I recommend you read my book because I was agnostic when I wrote it, but now you're going to be seeing through my lens of a Christian worldview, not in a modern sense, in the sense of what is of man, but in a sense of what I believe is objective truth formed as Christianity. So here's an example of how I've been really classifying things, and I wanted to understand the different branches, whether it's Adventism or Anabaptism, and Anglican, Baptist, Calvin's, Lutheran, Methodist, overall Pentecostal, right? From there, kind of breaking down even into a denomination and seeing how there's so many different sub-segments of a denomination. Even inside of that sub-segment, there's different conferences that kind of forming up a general world body, and then there's offshoots, right? And we've seen how interestingly how different offshoots have formed. Many of these have become cults, or just kind of just otherwise just different sects. For me, I want to kind of just get a sense on how do I make sense of all of this, and which, if we were to look at all of these religions as almost like a different road, as a pathway, which one makes the most sense? And so for me, I started to classify different beliefs, right? So maybe it's a belief around salvation or baptism or the day that you worship or God's law, the afterlife, right? And then figuring out what is my single source of truth. And I know this is going to be I'm jumping the gun here because I've already identified for me that the Bible is the single source of truth. The Bible is the objective truth. And again, if you're not there yet, I highly recommend either one of two things: reading my book on Theological, where I approach things agnostically, or two, suspending disbelief and just understanding the lens that I wear based on ultimately a lot of research and a lot of critical thought. So if you don't yet believe the way that I believe, that's, again, I'm not even trying to make you believe the way I believe, but if you want to understand through my lens, because most people haven't taken 5 years of their career off just to study world religions and history, and really trying to get a greater sense. So hopefully this series will just help you see through my takeaway, but please go back and don't accept what I say as truth on its own. I really recommend going deeper and figuring out what is truth to based on how God is speaking to you. For me, I do have gone really deep into a course on Bible truth that kind of talks about these different doctrinal beliefs, but for this we'll kind of move forward really just into understanding different world religions. So there are a staggering number of different world religions, denominations, and sects, just kind of as I showed you earlier how I started to classify them and break them into a way that I can start to analyze them independent of maybe other related denominations or even other related sects. Okay? As most of us know, religion is ultimately any belief regarding our origin story or the purpose of human existence. So while many say that certain philosophies are not religions, if they're beliefs, right, they're foundations for religion. So there really is no way to escape religion. Any belief structure, even in certain levels of science that you can't prove, ultimately becomes belief, becomes religion. There are, again, like a crazy amount of different religions out there, right? About 84% of those are really based on four main religions: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and some sort of, folk religions. We can kind of overlay these different religions based on really different areas of the world, and we can kind of see the spread of Catholicism, the spread of Islam, really Hinduism, and out of that, Buddhism, and how they've made major impacts across the world. So what I think is interesting is by starting to, again, trying to treat religion as a science, what can I learn from this, right? To get a sense on the total breakdown, we see that Christianity and Catholicism or about 1/3 of the population, followed then by Islam at 1/4, Hinduism, Buddhism at about 1/4, and the rest of the map is mostly made up of Chinese folk religions, and a minority of atheism. And what I think is interesting is atheism is a very small fraction of what the overall world believes, and yet atheism seems to be dictating much of the standards of what we are to believe, which I think is very backwards. Anyways, the next thing I want to do is get a sense on how do these religions kind of tie into each other. And I think it can be useful to start familiarizing ourselves with the various different logos as a way to understand really the implications of what that religion is all about, right? And a logo, as we know in my course on branding, is really a visual cue, an identifier for the values and for really the intangibles as well, that differentiation, everything to also product purpose, mission, vision, etc. So when we look at similarities, we see crescents, or we see crosses, or we see wheels, we see a light and a dark, we see 5 points. All these kind of help show ultimately some overlaps and some commonalities between different religions. It helps us spot similarities, right? Similarities between the pagan pentagram and the atheistic logo. Interestingly enough, the pentagram, Satan worship, and the atheist logo actually have some overlap, some commonality. I think that's interesting to me. I've created little kind of matching games, and so if you want to pause this video real quick and trying to see how many of these you can guess for yourself, I'm going to go ahead and flip the slide now. What we find is that, each religion ultimately is ingrained in many instances with that symbol that they carry. And so we can actually start taking and grouping these religions together ultimately by their relationship between God and man, right? And these we start to create these classifications of isms that can help us understand the various religions by seeing them as groups. And so when we see monotheism grouped together, we see pantheism, we kind of start to see different patterns start to form. Transtheism, as an example, we see the wheel in both of the main transtheism classifications, right? In polytheism, right, we can kind of start seeing these different classifications. Now, I do identify, I include some additional, religions that are newer. No judgments necessarily on if I identify them as a religion or a cult, but mostly just any religion that has really been formed in the last, let's say, 200 or so years, for me, has to be treated in different groups, right? You may notice that there's kind of 2 religions in that previously list, which are newer compared to the other ones, and that's Mormonism and Falun Gong. And those have most recently sprung up in the last couple hundred years, and so they don't trace back to any parent lineage. And I think that's interesting, right? So additionally, we see Baha'i, Christian Science, Falun Gong, Jehovah's Witness, and Scientology. These all sprung up in the same period of time. So my personal belief is that if a new religion springs up and it's not a purification or rebirth of a previous religion, but instead a brand new philosophy around a new God, then how can it be inspired? God, if you believe God is without time, why wait so long to show itself, right? Why, for this reason, I won't cover these religions so much, although I do go into some of these in my course on cults and brands. So we'll come back to that in a different course. But to regroup, if we look at the percentage, we see that the majority of religions understand God as monotheistic, right? Then polytheism, then pantheism, and then finally atheism. And we can explore these isms. But I just kind of want to point out, I think it's interesting that monotheism is the predominant, if we add up the population, is the predominant viewpoint. Now, let's explore real quick, before we get into theisms, let's explore both theism and deism, because we've noticed that there is this ism kind of, they all end with ism. So let's look at isms, okay? So the ism is going to be, the commonality is theism and deism both believe that God exists. Now, the main difference between theism and deism is that deism holds the belief that God does not intervene in human affairs, Whereas theism holds the belief that God intervenes in human affairs through miracles or supernatural revelations. And so that is kind of the core difference, right? When we look at deism, a deist believes that God created the world and then just walked away and abandoned it, right? So they believe that God has no control over the supernatural. There's no natural phenomenon occurring in the universe. And as such, they reject, most, any sort of religion that believes that there's an active present God. Now, theisms are where we can look at, these believe, with the exception of atheism, these believe in an active God, in a God that is ultimately playing an active role, hasn't just created and moved on to the next universe. Now, theisms can be kind of confusing because there's a lot of them. The analogy that I use to explain theism ultimately is, if we were to look at God as a source of energy, okay, then religion is essentially what outlet we are plugging ourselves into. Okay, so now, this is not to say that God is an energy source. Okay, I'm not getting into a pantheistic view, but the only way for me to explain all theisms is to analyze them as religion. But let's look at it first like this. So, the etymology or the history, the meaning of the words around theisms will actually give us a lot of context in of itself. So, mono means only one. So that means only one God. Heno translates to one by way of two. So that means there's one primary God and then sub-deities. Polytheism is more than one, so more than one God. Pan means of everything. So that's everything is made up or contains God. So the trees are God. They believe that they're in one with God. Trans means above. So they believe that they're actually above God. This is actually what we find in Jainism and Buddhism. While, Buddhism, first off, people will say Buddhism is not a religion. That's the first thing that I hear. The second thing is that, well, Buddhism doesn't necessarily believe in a God per se. But we will find when we actually research in Buddhism and what Buddha actually said is very different to that. And so I think people, if they haven't really researched and understand the religion that they call themselves a part of, anyways, I'm going to move on. So then finally we have A, which is lacking of, or atheism. So believe that there is no God. Okay? So we'll break each of these apart individually. Let's start with monotheism. So that's from a monotheistic perspective, a standpoint, right? We see that God is not an energy source, but instead a physical being, right? Monotheistic religions believe that there is only one God. The examples of monotheistic religions include Judaism, right? Or what we may think of the Jews who later will explore their lineage traces back to Hebrew and the Israelites. And most ancient religions actually date, it is the most ancient religion, dating back to about 6,000 years. And most religions actually kind of come from Judaism, right? So from the founder of the Israelites, Abraham, came another lineage of the son of Ishmael, which the nation of Islam came from. And each of these three religions of, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all date back to, through Abraham, dating back to Noah, ultimately dating back to Adam, with the exception of Baha'i, which is a brand new religion that just kind of popped up that says they're monotheistic, and we'll explore them in a little bit. So if we were to look at a way to kind of visually interpret or visually explain monotheism, one example of monotheism is Christianity. And in this, there's a belief that there is only one God. Now, as a breakaway from monotheism, henotheism is the next group. And henotheism believes in the worship of a single God while not denying the existence of lower sub-God deities. Okay, so if we were to analyze this as plugs, we would see that there's kind of one main plug, one main energy source, and then a bunch of smaller sub-deities, sub-energy sources. So examples of henotheism include Mormonism, Zoroastrianism, which dates back to about 4,000 years, teaching that the addition of this primary God, Ahura Mazda, or Muzud. And there's also a powerful god of darkness, right, which they've inverted in esoteric ways, but that's not the point. Catholicism is another example of henotheism, right? So Catholicism, which really attempts to connect itself with monotheistic Christianity, but formed out of Constantine's amalgamation of both paganism and Christianity, early Christianity, we see that it no longer falls under a monotheistic view as it elevates Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as Peter, to a position higher than man, right? So the Pope also identifies himself equal with God, God on earth. And so this is by definition not monotheistic, but henotheistic, one primary God and then sub-deities. Now, the next one going further is going to be polytheism. And polytheism teaches the worship of more than one God. So this is this idea that if we're looking at it as an energy source, there would be 2 main plugs, or 5 or 10 or 50 main plugs, that each of those have their own energy source. Now we find this in paganism, Hinduism, Sikhism, and other pagan religions. Why I think that this does not make sense in a single universe is that when we analyze energy, when we analyze mathematics, when we look at really nature, everything speaks to one energy source. And if there were multiple deities, multiple gods, multiple creators, then those creators would naturally conflict with one another. Okay, so an example of this is that in Hinduism, all the gods are essentially on the same level, and they're always constantly fighting with one another. And so, you could say, oh, well, the storms are 2 gods fighting, but any, basic view of science sees that it's actually not 2 energy sources conflicting with each other. It's actually one energy source in the way that it's interacting with different elements. And so it becomes very hard for me to create a rational case around polytheism because it undermines mathematics. It undermines ultimately basic science. And more than that, everything that I see in nature speaks to harmony and speaks to rational patterns, not speaking to a bunch of childlike temper tantrum gods fighting with each other. So we'll move on. Pantheism is a more recent evolution of theism, and this, again, rooting in the word pan, being a collection of many gods. This goes further than identifying God as one in the same as existence and other forms treat all living objects as gods, or even mankind is an unevolved God. So pantheism is essentially joining all energy into one. All the different plugs are actually kind of joined together. Examples, Taoism, Shinto, Qigong, Falun Gong, shamanism, and one example, let's just kind of take, Shinto, right, is defining that we are all joined in God. And so this is this kind of concept that, not only, that essentially that everything is God, God is in everything, and it kind of forms this concept that it's just all one big collective energy, and that we are ultimately part of that energy, and so we are part of God. Now, the next is Transtheism, which refers to a system of thought or religious philosophy that's neither theistic nor atheistic, if we were to really break it down. This also lines around autotheism, and the concept's the same, which believes that divinity, whether external or not, is inherently within oneself, and that one has the ability to become godlike. So what we see now is that if we were to look at it as an energy source, right, that we are the power source, and that Buddhism or Jainism, ultimately we look inward to ourselves to find power. And this has been, perpetuated really through most, even modern Christianity has, transtheistic ideas or kind of infiltrated into it. If we were to take Buddhism as an example, and we're going to get into, more specifically into the history of Buddhism later. But if we were to look at this and analyze this, the historical Buddha made it clear that the path to enlightenment does not depend on God or gods, right? And although there's an acknowledgement of multiple gods in the oldest of the Buddhist scriptures, there's a reference to Mahabrahma as an example, who considered himself to be the all-powerful creator God. But Buddha critiques Mahabrahma as having wrongly perceived his plane of existence as the highest. And so what we find out is that Buddha acknowledges the creator God, but then says that that creator God doesn't even know that there's a plane of existence higher than him. And Buddha then transcends to that plane of enlightenment. Now, again, we're going to get into the nuances of this, but this is just to say that if we were to break this down, we're actually looking at Buddhism as above God. Finally, then there's atheism. And atheism is the belief or lack of belief in gods. Atheism ultimately, is, different. You could say it's not a religion, but ultimately any set of beliefs is a religion. So, when we look at Confucianism or even scientism, right, these include, they can extend past what is science, right, and really move into a religion that there is no God and that we're not connected to anything, and this is all random chaos, and we evolved based on survival of the fittest or whatever theories. If we were to analyze this, ultimately it is that there is no God. So for atheists, life is an empty state consisting of only what you make of it. And I, ask, is this just the furthest elevation of self? Is atheism the next evolution to transtheism, where you actually now ignore any belief in God and you are all that exists? Okay, so what I think, if we really start looking at these in this linear way, I believe that there's a pattern that emerges, and we start to see how religions seek to elevate man as it's an effort to diminish God. So monotheism, right, one God, and then as we start adding in other people that elevate up, right, and we'll explain each of these individually, but I think it's interesting that as we go from the list of monotheism to atheism, God becomes less important. And as we go from monotheism to atheism, man becomes more important. And so when we actually see this, it's a linear pattern of diminishing God and elevating man. So let's walk through them. Objective reality is that there's one supreme God we will never be co-equals with. Okay, that's monotheism, one God. Then the deceiver elevates others up to a status just below God, right? Making a path for man to become demigods, right? Elevating man and ultimately bringing God down. So henotheism is this idea that man can become demigod, become sub-gods. Peter and Mary. Those are rebrandings that we find during the era of Constantine, really of rebranding of Zeus and rebranding of different forms of the female god and goddesses here. So we see that polytheism, all gods are equal. This then elevates that man up to the level of God, right? So now all gods are on the same level. Now, in Pantheism, we're no longer on the same level as God. We are now part of God. Man joins with God, not just equal, but one with God. So what we've seen is that the evolution from from polytheism to pantheism is we're now merged in with God. Then when we move to transtheism, this is where man ascends above God. Man is greater than God. Finally, we look at atheism, where man not only transcends God, but dismisses God entirely. And so we see this almost this inversion as we move from monotheism down to transtheism and into atheism. We see an inversion, really, and this is the esoteric viewpoints of ultimately, a view of a satanic version or a view of an elevation of man. To recap, there are different isms, which are different principles and doctrines. There are, deism is a belief that we were created, but then the creator just left, and we're here to, fend for ourselves and run autopilot without any intervention. The other view is theism, which believes that there is a God, with the exception of atheism, and that these various theisms are the various relationships between God and even humans in relationship to that God. So that's kind of, again, the breakdown, the recap. If you want to kind of test what you've learned, go ahead and pause the screen now and go ahead and test which religion belongs to which different trait, and see how those map out. And how'd you do, right? So, do you see anything differently now, maybe than you saw before? Are there any religions that tried to hide under other names or themes? Have you found, whether it's Sikhism or whether it's Catholicism or other, other religions that kind of seem to try and pretend that they're one type of ism, but they're actually another? Anyway, so this is really the start, to the series. In the next module, we'll get into the Theism Explorer, where we'll actually go through and actually study the different origins of the different religions, looking through history and how these religions really came about. But hopefully this was useful to you. Again, the recap from this was just seeing the relationship between the different theisms and ultimately how they form a linear pattern.